I'm Kelly Richardson. I'm the Managing Director for Perscolis Newark and New York. And I'm also a very proud board member of the coalition. Just on a personal note, this is my favorite workforce development day of the year. It really reminds me that I'm not alone in my work and that Perscolis is not alone in the work that we do. And I'm very proud to advocate for equitable pathways to careers in tech at Perscolis. I also love this day because I learned so much, so I'm really pleased to introduce our next panel. It's really a remarkable panel of folks from all over the tech industry talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion in tech. And so, if I can find there we go. We have my friend Patrick Cohen, fellow board member from NPower, Kia Floyd from Facebook, Jesse Haines from Google, Julie Samuels from Tech NYC, Grace Sue from IBM, all moderated by my friend Jen Curry. Thank you.
Thank you, Kelly. Thanks for having us to the coalition. We're really delighted to be here, and I hope that you've read everybody's bios on this panel because they are truly rock stars in this field. We're going to have a great conversation. I'm Jen Curry from Samaschool. We are a nonprofit that delivers training to low-income job seekers to help them understand and navigate the gig economy. So you can imagine that our work intersects with tech companies like Lyft and TaskRabbit and Urban Sitter and others in very deep ways, and I'm delighted to help moderate this conversation today. Before we jump in, I'll share one quick thing, which was actually a Tech NYC LinkedIn post last night that I read, so thank you, Julie, for that, which was a stat that said that 89% of New York City tech workers choose to live and work in New York City because of its diversity, instead of that other place on the West Coast that has something to do with tech. And personally, I grew up in Elmhurst, Queens. I went to the most diverse school, which was at the time the most diverse school in the whole city. So I know the beauty of diversity in New York. Obviously, the tech sector appreciates it, and that's why the folks who work in it are here. But what we're going to talk about a lot today is some of the challenges, because we know at the same time, despite all that, we have severe underrepresentation in the tech sector. So we're going to talk about the challenges and the solutions. Let's go ahead and get started. So my first question is, what are the barriers to making the tech sector more diverse? And I'm going to ask Patrick to start us off.
Good morning, everyone.
I'm not sure if they didn't hear you and just didn't respond.
Getting the technology right. So no, that's there are several barriers. There's some really troubling statistics in New York City. Only 18% of the workforce in technology space is Black and Latino, whereas it's 43% for non-tech jobs. So the barriers that we see at NPower, because we work on supplying or providing the workforce for this space for training young adults and veterans, and some of the barriers we see is a lack of commitment from leadership. So they should have the vision and a clear plan working with middle managers as well as HR, CSR, and diversity inclusion teams to set the goals, performance goals, and real plans to create a pipeline of talent. Some of the areas that we see some challenges and barriers are really with the HR requirements. We continuously see job descriptions that are asking for 4-year degrees and 1 to 4 years experience, and this is an entry-level job, so there's a disconnect there. So ways that we see, and we see some companies like JP Morgan Chase, our friend at Ali Morano, for example, at JP Morgan, they're working on competency-based models, right? Really looking at emotional intelligence as well as critical thinking and other factors to give these individuals an opportunity. And I've seen over the last 10 years where companies wouldn't hire our young adults, and they waited until we were able to prove the point and more testimonials. Other things that we see as well is with academic institutions. Of course, it's really tough to keep up with the technology trends and the curricula that they have because of the approval process and so forth. They're not as up to date typically, not all, but some of these academic institutions. And then some of the companies that we work with, they really want to make this connection with the communities in which where the talent is located, so they don't know how is what they asked us. So working with organizations like an NPower or Perscolis or YERUP, C4Q, and many others as a source, but that's not going to really move the needle. So it's really working with the K-12 pipeline, the career and technical education schools to expose them to careers in technologies. In technology, it's really important, doing volunteer events at these schools as well. And also, one of the things that we were able to do, we received a grant from the City Foundation to increase the number of women in our program to 40%. But when we evaluated our marketing materials, we didn't have many women of color on these marketing materials. So we made those changes. So those are some of the barriers that we've seen.
Grace looks like she's ready to jump in.
Well, I was just going to say that, absolutely about education and in the businesses themselves. I think there's obviously a lot of unconscious bias, and there needs to be a number of different efforts to overcome that in a very intentional and deliberate way in terms of the way that young people are recruited, the way they're onboarded, the way they're managed, and the way they're ultimately promoted. But I think really understanding that for businesses, understanding that kind of bias exists and finding ways to deliberately educate and train people within businesses to overcome that.
I think on the hiring front, all of these steps are important: hiring, development, retention, culture. All of those matter. On the hiring front, one thing that in this sort of back to school moment that we're all in is sort of, I wanted to share with the group that Google has been doing, is thinking about our relationships with universities. And we looked at the data and realized that we were basically focusing through our university programs on 77 universities that were not the most diverse universities. So we've actually tripled the number of universities in our sort of university programs, and sure enough, had a intern class this summer that was 49% Black, Hispanic, and women. So that's made a big difference. Another interesting thing to share is a program we did with Howard last summer called Howard West, where we brought a small cohort of Howard computer science students to the Google campus in Mountain View, and they took classes, interacted with engineers. That was so successful that we expanded the program. It's now called Tech Exchange to include 11 HSBUs. They just arrived on campus. They're going to be there for 9 months this time, again, taking classes with professors from their universities at Google, interacting with engineers, and just being exposed in a really real way to the world of technology.
At Facebook, Google and Facebook are often thought of in the same breath. Can you all hear me? They're often thought of in the same breath. So I was joking with Jesse on the way in, like, okay, are you Coke and I'm Pepsi? I'm not sure. So we often engage in some of the same activities and develop similar initiatives to try to address the lack of underrepresented minorities and other groups in the tech talent pipeline. But I think what we really are talking about, the underlying kind of the river that runs through everything, is the fact that the tech talent pipeline really is leaky, right? And our goal is to try to plug it. We look at everything from the way that public policies and lawmakers enact not necessarily well thought out pieces of legislation that are often more reactive, and what signal that sends to startups of tomorrow that will never get going in a particular location because they don't find the regulatory environment to be friendly. We also look at investments in education as a very long-term pursuit. So if you talk about the tech talent pipeline as only what you're doing today to hire, then you're missing a large part of where I think where you need to go in understanding that it's a long continuum, right? It starts with early exposure in the K-12 environment. Then you move into intermediate exposure for kids that actually have taken to STEM disciplines and have an interest in math and science and the confidence to keep going. And then ultimately, once they're ready to go to college and start developing true job readiness skills, that's full immersion. they're coding, or they're taking engineering classes, or they're doing something towards that occupational pathway. So for us, we're looking at programs that will allow us to tap into diverse talent at each point along the continuum, because we've really been heavily focused, I think, on the latter end, and we've missed a lot. To, I think, Patrick and Grace's point, the third leg of the stool, if you've got academic exposure, public policies that enable and motivate tech innovation, the third stool has to be tackling the cultural, and as Grace mentioned, the unconscious bias, right? We are very, very aggressive in having uncomfortable conversations amongst ourselves at Facebook, which means that we, actively seek out members of the majority community and send them to minority social events or experiential. There's nothing more telling than sending the lone white cisgender 25-year-old male to a minority event and giving them a sense of what that might feel like every day to be the only one. And that empathy that you create in giving personal investment in the what's often thought of as a cause really does change behavior. If you have hiring executives that themselves don't have diverse social circles, they see diversity as a cause. Got to transition that mindset from thinking that Silicon Valley is a pure meritocracy. Because when you think that you're special for getting in, and everyone who didn't get in isn't as special or isn't as smart or isn't as competitive, that is self-validating data that you're gathering, right? From people who look just like you.
Yeah, I'm going to pick up on that. No, that's a perfect.
I told you, give me the gong if you need to.
No, you set me up really nicely for a segue, so I'm going to take advantage of it. Because, what you're starting to talk about is not just the recruitment and the pipeline, but retention and what's happening at a company, right, and the company culture. Because we know that for a lot of people, be it women, people of color, et cetera, you can show up to that job, you're fully qualified, you're confident, and you're not welcome in that space. Right, and that's another reason why we have an underrepresentation problem in this sector and in many others. So maybe we'll start here with Julie and Jesse on this question of, what is it about company culture that either makes it inclusive or not, and how can we sort of tackle that piece of the equation?
I'm going to let Jesse talk a little bit about what happens at Google, but I just want to kind of, with regard to retention, but also with regard to the pipeline and everything we've been talking about. This is an amazing conversation we're having, but we're having a conversation with really large companies right now who have the resources to do a lot of these things. And I want to make sure that as we think about this and talk about this, we're also, there's a whole kind of separate set of considerations for smaller companies, many of whom want, I think, and I think working with organizations like NPower is really meaningful for those smaller organizations because I cannot tell you more than any group of people I've ever worked with. The New York tech community, I believe, fundamentally wants to support a diverse community. For smaller companies, I don't want to say it's harder because that's not fair. It's not that it's harder. It's that they sometimes don't have the tools, they don't have the resources, they maybe don't have the budget. And so finding out ways to plug those growing companies in is incumbent upon all of us. And then, as far as retention and culture, I'll let Jesse kind of take that one first, and then I'll weigh in after.
Yeah, no, thank you. Google is a place that, like Facebook and these other technologies, we pride ourselves on our culture. And the data shows that, people who will stay if they are feeling and being included. And so it has been very eye-opening to look at the data. We have a company-wide satisfaction survey called Google Guys that we do it every year, and underrepresented groups are not feeling included at Google, and so relative to others. We've talked a lot about unconscious bias already, and that is obviously a huge first step. Like, let's figure out how and be self-aware about that unconscious bias. 75% of the company has taken a class on unconscious bias. And now the next piece is but then what do you do? So it wasn't enough to kind of that was a good first step, but now we are having the entire company learn about kind of what actions we can take in those moments. We've also taken a very googly approach to the culture and really tried to dig into the data. And an interesting finding, but although maybe not surprising, is that managers play a huge role in creating positive culture and inclusion. And this goes for everyone. You know, right? You join companies, you leave managers, you leave people. So we've been investing a ton in our managers who really create that micro environment and really helping them get better at creating an inclusive culture, because that's really popped in the data for us.
Something that strikes me as really interesting is that with regard to, you know, all three of your companies and many of the other really large ones, you play this interesting role in the ecosystem as well, which is kind of like, you know, younger employees want to come work at Google or Facebook or IBM, and then, you know, the way the tech ecosystem works is they want to jump and maybe go to a startup after they learn some skills, maybe go somewhere it's a little riskier or, you know, get more equity, whatever the thing might be. And so in many ways, you know, it's incumbent upon the large companies to, I think, be an even bigger tent, and also to the extent, of course, larger companies set the culture, I think, for the ecosystem. But it's an interesting role you guys play, because some people jump because they're not happy, but some people jump because they want a different experience, and that's all part of a successful ecosystem.
Yeah.
Because then hopefully you buy their companies, and then everyone's happy.
Since we're here in New York City, and I've been at Google for 12 years and I've spent my whole career in New York, another thing that we've learned is that it's the macro, like it's the environment. It's like, where is the office? And Silicon Valley is not always where everyone wants to live. And so we are now, every time we post a new job, really taking a moment, and it's always been Mountain View. And I've fought hard to get more, projects and people here. And obviously we have a huge New York office, but it can be bigger, and we can give that option because that can make a big difference. So I'm personally very excited that Google is really rethinking about every new job that we post. Does it really have to be in Mountain View? Could it be in New York?
That's actually pretty interesting, because we have found, I think, more of the opposite, which is that the recruits that come to New York, yeah, they like Facebook, but they really want to live in New York, right? So they come here, and to your point, that the diversity, that the culture, that the vibrancy of the city is what draws them here. They don't want to necessarily be stuck in the Silicon Valley, where it's not as vibrant and where they have to travel into San Francisco to go to whatever the hottest cultural activity is. But what I think we've done, and we're just starting, so we're in our infancy, but I manage both public policy and community engagement. And when I joined the company a year ago, after being at another large data analytics company, the first thing I said was, okay, so I will manage community engagement, and to each of the chiefs, the engineer chiefs and heads of office, I said, how do you define community? And I remember that moment where these super smart people were stuck. They couldn't actually tell me, how does a hardcore engineering office, where the majority of employees are paid to do this all day long, and they're sole contributors to the organization, right? Their job is to write code, make sure it works, get a product from start to finish. They don't necessarily have to work with cross-functional teams in order to do that, right? They don't have to be project managers in order to get their code or their formula to work. How do you define community when those folks are every day not necessarily in the community? And the mind shift, which is probably why I got the job, now that I think about it, is understanding that for tech communities that don't have brick and mortar locations per se, we're not a hardware manufacturer, so you can't walk into, a Facebook store and engage with us, that we have to do more, because the community that we build on the platform doesn't necessarily translate to the community on the street, so to speak. And so, when I'm out at community events and speaking, I always generally will say, raise your hand if you know where the Facebook office is. Raise your hand if you know that we had an office here. And I'm always really surprised at the number of people who don't know us. So Google, I think, has done a great job in Chelsea, and that acquiring, and really taking root in, your space at the Chelsea Market and having YouTube there and all these things that people can hear about. You see the Google sign. We're working with very basic questions like, should we put a sign outside? We don't have a sign. So how do you create mind share around who you are? How do you put a face on Facebook when people honestly can say, I don't really know much about you? So what I've endeavored to do, and I think it's a big task, but again, we're starting small, is we are shifting our focus for community engagement to hopefully a neighborhood-based approach, where we will have employee resource groups and convenings around Brooklyn, Staten Island, Jersey City, where most of our employees live. I want to have cadres of employees that act as like ambassadors or committees, where they then cascade back what's important to them, because their senses of community seem to be very closely tied, at least from the survey results I've been receiving, to where they live, not where they work. And that's important, because when I look at where our employees are living, if they are not in the farthest reaching aspects of Brooklyn, then why am I sending philanthropic dollars to a place that are really going to only provide transactional opportunities, not sustaining relationships? And so that's a novel way to approach things for us. I don't know if others have other ideas, but...
Yeah. No, that's fantastic. I just want to also include, as far as the inclusion piece, that it's really important to have mentoring, right? The onboarding of these individuals when they come to an organization, to make sure they have the right training, and mentoring, not only mid-level mentor, but a senior level. I just had a call with Facebook yesterday about the mentoring opportunity and programs they have. We've had some students that have been placed at a large bank, for example, and the manager that's familiar with our program or onboarded them left. So they have a new manager, and they feel isolated. One in particular was in a cybersecurity role, and he left after 3 years because he felt isolated, racial bias, and he went back to school, right? Which made no sense. It was counterintuitive. But I think it's really, really important just not only to recruit these individuals, but what are some other creative policies to really make sure that their voices and opinions are valued and appreciated. And I think it's also important too to pay equity and making sure that they're a plan to help them to get promoted, because they come in and they feel like they're overlooked many times. So I think all of those things can factor in.
Thanks to you all for sharing those specific anecdotes and sort of data from your experiences. And if we were to take a step back and spend a few minutes talking about policy and what we can do at scale to ensure that the tech sector and other sectors that aren't off the hook, by the way, become more diverse, what are the public policy barriers and solutions? And I'll start with Grace, and then Key and Julie would love to hear everybody else weigh in.
So we've been focusing a lot at IBM, and Kia talked about it, the leaky pipeline, and really thinking about it in terms of education and workforce development. So we've been working both on the federal level as well as at the state level to help understand how do you create a real pipeline from school to work. And so we heavily advocated for the passage of the Perkins Act at the federal level, which provides $1.2 billion toward CTE education. And it was reauthorized with a focus on labor market standards, linking education to labor market standards and the involvement of industry. We've also been working with states to promote a model that we started at IBM called the P-TECH 9 to 14 school model. And it's really designed to change education as we know it. And it's designed to really provide a new way of high school across the country and really change the American education landscape. Not for all students, but for those that it makes sense. And students at P-TECH schools are graduating with both their high school diploma and their 2-year associate's degree at the same time. And industry is heavily involved. So they're at the table as a full partner, providing the mentoring. We do worksite visits with the kids. It goes from application to exposure. Then they get internships at IBM at age 16. 16 and other industry partners, which is a new concept for many companies to have 16-year-olds in their offices. And then ultimately, when they graduate, they're first in line for jobs, which is not a guarantee of a job, but that means you get an interview and a chance to be in front of a hiring manager and showcase yourself beyond your resume. It's open enrollment and serves primarily underserved young people, and the degree is provided for free. So we started with one school in Brooklyn, New York, 70% African-American male, and now we're in 110 schools across 8 states and 4 countries, all focused on breaking the cycle of poverty, addressing the education gap and those leaky pipelines, and focused on workforce development and the skills gap. There are 550 businesses now involved, understanding that you really have to get in on the ground to develop your talent pipeline. You can't wait to people knocking on your door. If you want to develop a diverse talent pipeline, you've got to start at younger ages. We have, beyond just the replication, we're seeing graduation rates 4 times the national on-time community college graduation rate, which is at 13%. We've hired 23 young people thus far into our company. It just started in 2011. We've had 185 graduates. So it's not the answer to diversity, but we believe it's one. We really want to focus on systemic solutions that go beyond even our company and enable others to join in, because we know that, just alone will make, this much of an impact, and if we involve others, it'll ripple out.
Is ditto an acceptable answer?
Absolutely.
No, I'm joking. I actually share a lot of Grace's very aptly summarized thoughts about the value of the exposure, again, in the education space in particular. Just thinking, if you segment education into that K-12 learning, the exposure-oriented exercises, and then higher ed, I've been focusing a lot more now on how we can add value as a net contributor in K-12 public policy dialogues. So some of you may have heard that Governor Cuomo this year allotted $30 million over 5, is it over 5 years, Julie? Over 6 years? Okay. So it's about, yeah, I was going to say, I thought it was 5. So roughly $6 million a year over the next 5 years to allow every state school to develop a CS, a computer science education curriculum program of some sort. While that is a fantastic public policy proposal, with anything else, it's just the devil's in the details, right? Is that you've got a very highbrow idea, and how does it distill down to your neighborhood school district? How much money does your school district get when it's a competitive process? And while the funds are to be allotted according to need, one of the things that we've experienced is, even when we try to just donate refurbished laptops, is the schools that are in the most dire need lack the IT infrastructure and the teachers to be able to implement and use the technology you want to give them. So if I want to give away refurbished laptops, you have to have someone who can repair and fix them when they break down. Someone who can safeguard them so that if a student lives in a crime-ridden area, that they're not a target when they come home with their laptop. Someone who can help them do the homework that you're now requiring when their mother or their father doesn't have those digital skills. And so that's a fairly, I apologize if that's nuanced, but that's the challenge that we face. So when I see $30 million, I say, terrific, but how will it impact the lowest lying, lowest performing schools that we all know need the most help? And so for us, understanding that, now, being in tech is pretty sexy, right? Everyone wants to get a tech job or be in the tech industry in some way. But when you think about the kids right now that are 10 years old, and as I said, that investment doesn't take root until 2025. It's not actually coming to fruition until 2025. If you're 10 years old now, that's roughly 7 years or so that you'll be 17 before there's a guarantee that your school has a curriculum in place. So what do you do in the interim? Because at 17, now you're already at the immersion piece of the continuum, and if you're not ready, you're not ready, and it's going to be very difficult to catch up. So just remember that the tech industry is still, relatively speaking, in our spaces, newer. IBM, you're a legacy. but the rest of us haven't been around that long. And so we're evolving as we go and trying to develop innovative solutions to problems that far preceded us. So I think that culturally there needs to be a recognition of that so that you appropriately separate the innovation that we usher in around products and don't attribute that same innovative thinking to everything else we do, because for us, some of these solutions aren't thought of until we recognize what the problem is.
Thank you. And Julie, do you want to
Yeah, on
answer?
the policy side, I think you guys have done an amazing job talking about the pipeline. We've seen this money set aside at the state. At the city level, there's CS for All, which is an $80 million public-private partnership to train teachers over 10 years for all New York City schools, which is amazing. You guys heard from Andrew about Civic Hall and the amazing building they're building. So there are all, and that took the city to come to the table to make that happen. There are all these great things that are happening. There are a bunch of secondary policy considerations that I would also point out. I mean, the primary one, I think, is around infrastructure, access to connectivity, a well-functioning transportation system. Like, the reason New York, I would say the primary reason that we are able to celebrate diversity here is because people can get around. You don't need to live exactly where you work when the subway is working. So, and that is frankly a big part of the problem in the Valley. Like, if you work down the peninsula in Menlo Park or in Mountain View or wherever, it's very difficult to get around. You need a car, you need some kind of private transportation. You don't need that here. It's key. Key and I were talking before, other things too, like City Council just capped the number of rideshare vehicles on the road, which isn't going to hurt people who live in Manhattan. It's going to hurt people who live in the outer boroughs who are going to have a harder time getting access to transportation. So these are all the things that we're thinking a lot about. Yes, the primary, how do you fix the pipeline? How do you get the education system working? How do you... Actually, the city's doing some really interesting stuff too around funding women entrepreneurs specifically, actually putting money where their mouth is, which is amazing to see. We didn't talk about the entrepreneurship piece of the equation, which is also really interesting, how you get a diverse population building the businesses. I'm super interested in that, and there's a lot of public policy considerations there, but I don't want to lose sight of those, again, secondary infrastructure pieces. If you don't have access to high-speed internet in your house, it doesn't matter if you get a Facebook laptop, right? If you can't get online with it, then it's useless. So, all of which is to say, we've got a lot of work to do. Yeah.
Jesse, do you want a 30-second last?
I have a few quick thoughts. I mean, I think that where I think Google can play a role and is playing a role is trying to pilot and kind of put proof of concept out there. We're putting Wi-Fi on school buses to give learning hours to kids who have super long commutes. Not a New York City issue because people are taking the subway, but really relevant to rural communities. We started this conversation talking about four-year college degrees and how that's such a barrier. We have an IT support training program because Google was having trouble hiring folks for our tech support jobs, and we were asking for four-year college degrees, and we said, this is crazy. We got to rethink this. And we ran a pilot and we figured out that, hey, guess what? You actually don't need a four-year college degree to be successful in IT support. And we built a training program that takes you from beginner to entry-level job ready in around 8 months. And we made that and we put it out there for everyone, got a lot of other tech companies and just big companies on board because everyone needs great IT talent, and have a hiring consortium waiting for folks who complete this program and want to share their information so that there's a real pathway to jobs. And now that that's out there and it's getting some traction, and by the way, your P-Tech program is so amazing, so just so inspiring, and we're really looking at that as a great model. Now our hope is that we can get the community college system involved, and we can get some of these education grants to apply to these types of programs, because education is in the way that we think about it is really changing, and some of those associated policies need to change too.
So I think we're about to get the hook. We could talk all day about this topic. Thank you so much to this amazing panel of folks doing the work, demonstrating projects and programs and practices that are really going to lead the way. So let's give them a big thank you. And we hope you enjoy the rest of the day.